warp drive is a hypothetical faster-than-light propulsion system in many works, most notably Star Trek. A spacecraft equipped with a warp drive may travel at apparent speeds greater than that of light by many orders of magnitude, while circumventing the relativistic problem of time dilation. In contrast to many other FTL technologies, such as a jump drive or the Infinite Improbability Drive, the warp drive does not permit instantaneous travel between 2 points. Instead, warp drive technology creates an artificial bubble of normal space-time which surrounds the spacecraft. Consequently, spacecraft at warp velocity can continue to interact with objects in normal space. Some of the other fiction in which warp drive technology is featured include Stars, EVE Online, Earth and Beyond, StarCraft, DarkSpace, Starship Troopers, Doctor Who, and Star Ocean. The original series, establishing a background, warp drive is one of the fundamental features of the Star Trek franchise. In the first pilot episode of Star Trek, the original series, The Cage, it is referred to as a hyperdrive/time warp drive combination, and it is stated that the time barrier has been broken, allowing a group of stranded interstellar travelers to return to Earth far sooner than would have otherwise been possible. The episode Metamorphosis, also from the original series, establishes a backstory for the invention of warp drive on Earth, in which Sven Cochrane discovered the space warp. Cochrane is repeatedly referred to afterwards, but the exact details of the first warp trials were not shown until the second Star Trek, The Next Generation movie, Star Trek, First Contact. The movie depicts Cochrane as having first operated warp drive on Earth in 2063. By using a matter-antimatter reactor to create plasma, and by sending this plasma through warp coils, he created a warp bubble which he could use to move a craft into subspace, thus allowing it to exceed the speed of light. This successful first trial led directly to first contact with the Vulcans. Enterprise, leading up to the original series. Later on, a prequel series titled Star Trek, Enterprise describes the warp engine technology as a gravimetric field displacement manifold, and describes the device as being powered by a matter-antimatter reaction which powers the two separate nacelles to create a displacement field. The episode also firmly establishes that many other civilizations had warp drive before humans. First Contact co-writer Ronald D. Moore suggested Cochrane's drive was in some way superior to forms which existed beforehand, and was gradually adopted by the galaxy at large. Throughout the series, the viewer is made aware that Vulcans have more advanced warp drive technology than humans in the 22nd century. Enterprise, set in 2151 and onwards, follows the voyages of the first human ship capable of traveling at warp factor 5.2, which under the old warp table formula, is about 140 times the speed of light. In the episode Broken Bow, Captain Archer equates warp 4.5 to Neptune and back, from Earth in 6 minutes, though previous Star Trek series had established that use of warp drive within a solar system presents extreme danger to both the ship and the surrounding planets. The Next Generation onwards, plots involving the Enterprise traveling beyond Warp 10 were once in the original series, but for the Next Generation it was decided that these would no longer be featured. A new warp scale was drawn up, with warp factor 10 set as an unattainable maximum. This is described in some technical manuals as Eugene's limit, in homage to creator producer Gene Roddenberry. Normal maximum warp in the original series was warp 8. The limit of 10 did not entirely stop warp inflation. By the mid-24th century, the Enterprise D could travel at warp 9.8 at extreme risk, while normal maximum operating speed was warp 9.6 and maximum rated cruise was warp 9.2. According to the Deep Space Nine Tech Manual, during the Dominion War, Galaxy-class starships were refitted with newer technology including modifications which increased their maximum speed to warp 9.9. In the episode, Where No One Has Gone Before, the Enterprise D was shown to exceed warp 10, traveling a billion light-years from their home galaxy in a matter of seconds. The Intrepid-class starship Voyager has a maximum sustainable cruising speed of warp 9.975, the Enterprise E can go even faster at warp 9.995. In the alternative future depicted in All Good Things, the future Enterprise travels at warp 13, although it is never established whether this is above warp 10, or simply the result of another reconfiguration of the warp scale. Warp velocities. Warp drive velocity in Star Trek is generally expressed in warp factor units, which euro according to the Star Trek technical manual also euro correspond to the magnitude of the warp field. Achieving warp factor 1 is equal to breaking the light barrier, while the actual velocity corresponding to higher factors is determined using an ambiguous formula. Several episodes of the original series place the Enterprise in peril by having it travel at high warp factors. At one point in that which survives, the Enterprise traveled at a warp factor of 14.1. In the Star Trek, The Next Generation episode The Most Toys, the crew of Enterprise D discovers that the android data may have been stolen while on board another ship, Jovis. At this point the Jovis, which has a maximum warp factor of 3, has had a 23-hour head start, which the Enterprise D figures puts her anywhere within a 0.102 light-year radius of her last known position. However, the velocity of any given warp factor is rarely the subject of explicit expression, and travel times for specific interstellar distances are not consistent through the various series. According to the Star Trek episode Writer's Guide for the original series, warp factors are converted to multiples of c with the cubic function v equals w3c, where w is the warp factor, v is the velocity, and c is the speed of light. Accordingly, warp 1 is equivalent to the speed of light, warp 2 is 8 times the speed of light, warp 3 is 27 times the speed of light, etc. For Star Trek, The Next Generation and a subsequent series, Star Trek artist Michael Okuda devised a formula based on the original one but with important differences. For warp factors 1 through 9, v equals w10/3c. In the half-open interval from warp 9 to warp 10, the exponent of w increases toward infinity. Thus, in the Okuda scale, warp velocities approach warp 10 asymptotically. There is no exact formula for this interval because the quoted velocities are based on a hand-drawn curve. What can be said is that at velocities greater than warp 9, the form of the warp function changes because of an increase in the exponent of the warp factor w. Due to the resultant increase in the derivative, even minor changes in the warp factor eventually correspond to a greater than exponential change in velocity. In the episode Threshold, Tom Paris breaks the warp 10 threshold. Exact velocities were given in a few episodes, one being Relativity, where Catherine Janeway describes Voyager's velocity at warp factor 9.975. Voyager was about 70,000 light-years away from home, and crew would often use 75 years as the time it would take to get back home at top speed. This means the Voyager series used the old method of warp calculation. 70,000/9.9753 is roughly 71 years. If delays for refueling, repair, restocking, and downtime are considered, 75 years is a logical rounding. Slingshot effect, a curious extension of warp travel, shown throughout Star Trek, is the slingshot effect. First discovered accidentally in Tomorrow Is Yesterday, one of the earlier episodes of the original Star Trek series, it is a method of time travel. Whereas the actual procedure is intentionally obscure, it involved traveling at a high warp velocity in the direction of a star, on a precisely calculated slingshot path. If successful, the ship is caused to travel to a desired point, past or future. The same technique was used later in the episode Assignment, Earth for historic research. In this episode, the warp factor required for time warp is given the name light speed breakaway factor. The term time warp was first used in The Naked Time, when a previously untried cold start intermix of matter and antimatter threw the Enterprise back 3 days in time. The term was later used in Star Trek IV in describing the slingshot effect. The technique was mentioned as a viable method of time travel in the TNG episode Time Squared. This slingshot effect has been explored in theoretical physics. It is hypothetically possible to slingshot oneself around the event horizon of a black hole. The result of such a maneuver would cause time to pass at a faster rate, relative to the ship within the event horizon. Such a journey would, unfortunately, be a one-way trip into the future. The pilot of the craft would not have traveled through time in the classical sense, but would instead have merely fast-forwarded through the intervening years. Travel in entropic directions other than forwards remain impossible to ascertain within the rubric of special relativity, but the time warp drive seen in the cage may explain some of the issues. Fans of the show and films have noted the slingshot involves a star, rather than a black hole, and the most normal consensus from its use concerns the nature of warp travel and warp velocities. A black hole is noteworthy for its singularity and associated event horizon, where not even light possesses escape velocity. Being able to travel at transluminal velocity would not necessarily make it possible to escape a black hole, as the common notion that a black hole merely possesses an escape velocity greater than c is not correct. Rather, inside the event horizon of a black hole, all paths in the space-time geometry lead closer to the singularity. Warp core, a primary component of the warp drive method of propulsion in the Star Trek universe, is the gravimetric field displacement manifold, more commonly referred to as a warp core. It is a fictional reactor that taps the energy released in a matter-antimatter annihilation to provide the energy necessary to power a starship's warp drive, allowing faster-than-light travel. Starship warp cores generally also serve as power plants for other primary ship systems. When matter and antimatter come into contact, they annihilate. Both matter and antimatter are converted directly and entirely into enormous quantities of energy, in the form of subnuclear particles and electromagnetic radiation. In the Star Trek universe, fictional dilithium crystals are used to regulate this reaction. These crystals are described as being non-reactive to antimatter when bombarded with high levels of radiation. Usually, the reactants are deuterium, which is an isotope of hydrogen, and antideuterium. In the original series and in universe chronologically subsequent series, the warp core reaction chamber is often referred to as the dilithium intermix chamber, or the matter-antimatter reaction chamber, depending upon the ship's intermix type. The reaction chamber is surrounded by powerful magnetic fields to contain the antimatter. If the containment fields ever fail, the subsequent interaction of the antimatter fuel with the container walls would result in a catastrophic release of energy, with the resultant explosion capable of utterly destroying the ship. Such warp core breaches are used as plot devices in many Star Trek episodes. An intentional warp core breach can also be deliberately created, as one of the methods by which a starship can be made to self-destruct. The mechanisms that provide a starship's propulsive force are the warp nacelles, cylindrical pods that are offset from the hull of the ship by large pylons. The nacelles generate the actual warp bubble that surrounds the ship, and destruction of one or both nacelles will cripple the ship, and possibly cause a warp core breach. Real-world theories in science. A theoretical solution for faster-than-light travel which models the warp drive concept, called the Alcubierre drive, was formulated by physicist Miguel Alcubierre in 1994. Subsequent calculations found that such a model would require negative mass, the existence of which has never been supported by any evidence, and prohibitive amounts of energy. However, it has recently been found that by changing the shape of the warp drive, much less negative mass and energy could be used, though the energy required is still many orders of magnitude greater than anything currently possible by human beings' technology. NASA engineers have begun preliminary research on such technology. See also. Notes. External links: warp drive at memory alpha, warp core at memory alpha, transwarp drive at memory alpha, quantum slipstream drive at memory alpha, warp drive. When? A NASA feasibility article, Special Relativity Simulator. What would things look like at near warp speeds? Alcubierre warp drive at the Encyclopedia of Astrobiology, Astronomy, and Spaceflight, warp drive possible. BBC News, June 10, 1999. Retrieved August 5, 2008. The warp drive could become science fact.